Hi. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to Explore, a faculty led webinar series designed to help high school students discover and engage with different academic disciplines. Through these webinars, Ashoka faculty will give you a glimpse of how subjects are taught and studied at Ashoka. Thank you so much for joining in today. Today's session is on understanding ourselves and others, the science of social cognition. I am Surbi. I am an alum and current employee of Ashoka University. Joining me today is one of Ashoka's most distinguished speakers, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce them to all of you. Professor Bittu Kaveri Rajaraman is an associate professor of biology and psychology at Ashoka University. They received a Ph.D. from Harvard University in neuroscience and went on to become a D.S.T. Kothari postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, and then an Inspire faculty fellow at Central University of Hyderabad. Professor Bittu works on the evolution of neural and behavioral systems of communication, the neuroethology of temporal pattern recognition in insects, and quantitative and economic cognition more broadly in zebrafish, dogs, and humans. A very, very warm welcome to you, Professor. We also have with us an Ashoka student, Shambhavi Rai. Welcome, Shambhavi. Before we get started, I would like to inform all our audience that registrations for the undergraduate program starting next year, that is 2026 of August, are now open. I would encourage students to register soon and have access to personalized mentorship with our academic counselors, interactions with Ashoka students to learn more about the campus life, and receive guidance for Ashoka's holistic admission process. Now, without further ado, let's get started. I would request our audience to kindly type any questions that they have in the Q&A box provided on your Zoom screen. We will be then taking them up at the end of the session. Over to you, Shambhavi.
Hello, everyone. As Surabhi has been kind enough to introduce me, I'm Shambhavi Rai. I'm currently a fourth year student at Ashoka University. I'm pursuing my BSc in psychology with a minor in biology. I am also doing my thesis under Professor Bittu right now, and I have been working in the lab for about 2 years right now. Uh, my own work is also in the area of social cognition, and but I would not like to bog you all down by the information right from the beginning. So I'll let Professor Bittu take it forward, let a little bit of introduction, and then we'll see if you guys are interested in my work.
Actually, I think people might be more interested in your work than some of the other stuff that happens in the lab because it is about social cognition. So actually, maybe we can start with you because I assume what most students want to get a sense of, which many of you may have already seen the website or checked out what courses we offer or what kind of research we have to offer. But people typically from these webinars want to get a sense of what their actual life in Ashoka will be like. So although this varies a little bit from lab to lab, we encourage people to join our lab as early as they would like. In fact, technically, even if you never end up at Ashoka, you can, or before you ever come here, you can always do research in our lab as a school student. But therefore, most people in our lab, join the lab within their first or second years. One person's already asked a question. I'm from a tier 3 college and an average student. How to get research experience and internship in the first year? It's very simple. Just write an email and you can get research experience. For us, it doesn't matter where you're from. Actually, we really don't care what grades you get in your classes either, because as I often like to say, the skills that make one do great lab work are very different from the skills that it takes to, ratamaru or do well in exam, or, these are all differing skill sets. And some of our best, most interesting work in the lab is done by people who don't sometimes some of our work is seeded by people who are working with us in the field who don't have a school degree. So you don't need actually a formal education to do science at all. And so any of you who are in school are, have certainly more than enough background to do research in our lab. So just write to me. My email address is bittu@ashoka.edu.in. If you want to work in the lab, just write to us. But the point is, most people in the lab, just for practical considerations, end up being first or second year students who are here. And the lab philosophy is basically that, we try to do science as cheaply as possible. By cheaply, I mean like with the minimum budget possible, right? So the reason we do this is, one, we believe that science shouldn't be something that is tied to very, lots of funding. And so we want, and eventually we would like schools to also be encouraging students to do research. And, and then many schools have like labs, well, it depends on which university you're talking about, Yashwant, but yes, our lab, I know it's not common across all universities and labs, but yeah, I respond to cold emails, even if I get a large number of them a day, and I may respond a week or two late, but I'll respond to every cold email. So yes, the principle of our lab is that anyone can join. And then I don't tell people, this is your work, this is what you have to do. You figure out what you want to do, you enjoy yourself. And if you keep returning to the lab because you keep wanting to work, then, things go forward. So that was the case with Shambhavi. Shambhavi, you joined in your second year, I think, right?
Second year. Yeah.
Second year?
I mean, I kind of relate little bit to the point because I also felt like I'm not equipped enough to like get into research because the
Right.
idea of academia is that, oh, you have to be like very smart or like you have to be like somewhat overly involved in it to do something. And I'm like, oh, I have not done any of that. But also because I think Ashoka does kind of give you that exposure to kind like also that worry to be like, oh, you have to do something, you have to do something. So in my second year, I was up on Google looking up at the lab profile, seeing if there's any project I would like to work into. And the way I got into lab was just to reach out to you and then the person at that point, Arpita, whose project I was got to be a part of. And then we just had a meeting, and then she was like, oh, so why do you want to join the project? And I didn't had any like technical answer because I was like, oh, I just want experience. And then she was like, yeah, sure, then you just have to like work. And I was like, yeah, great. And that's how I got into lab. Uh, for majority of my work in lab for like last year was limited to that project, but I think I have like after being in, I've realized maybe that wasn't the exact thing I wanted to get into, and which is how I arrived to think I'm currently doing under Professor Bittu. So as somebody who's really interested in like social behavior and group behavior in itself, but not particularly in humans, more or less in uh, animals, if that what I'm allowed to do say right now. And I read a paper, I was reading a book for an exam, and it just said one line that aggressive mice tend to, be like display more dominant behavior and do better in cognitive performance test compared to non-aggressive mice. And I was like, oh, interesting. Is that also because stuff like aggression and like dominance and hierarchy is something that is so parallel to the human world that I was like, oh, where else can we see this? So because I've already been a part of the zebrafish lab, I was like, okay, let me see if this is also possible in zebrafish. And turns out it is. So there is a system of hierarchy, which is there is a dominant fish and a submissive fish in senses of which fish is more likely to be more, not just be aggressive, but also kind of secure more food, lead the group more or less. And I was like, I am particularly interested in seeing the effect of this hierarchy or status in cognitive performance, but not cognition in the sense of social cognition or behavior, but cognition isolated. So, can social behaviors then carry out to your isolated individual actions? Because instinctively, we understand that, oh, if there's a hierarchy, the hierarchy will only play out in other hierarchical situations. But will that hierarchy also carry out in your individual action and your baseline activity is something I'm interested in exploring, which is what I'm doing my thesis right now.
Very cool. And so, yeah, that's Shambhavi's research journey, and we'll get into kind of what the courses and teaching are like in a minute. But to just fill you in on what sort of other people do in the lab, um, uh, you know, um, people, some people work on, so, most of the social cognition projects, I think Shambhavi's been involved in one way or another. So the first project that she worked on, that the social isolation project, is actually one that Shambhavi, as an undergrad, as a second year, going into her third year, actually contributed enough data to be an author on the publication. And it's a publication that is now going to be part of an invited issue of a journal. So congratulations, Shambhavi, first of all. And so that basically means that many of you who, if you're really interested, and, being interested is not something to like, to show you're interested. Like if you actually enjoy it, because the work involves doing lots and lots of hours of watching zebrafish behave. If you're into it, you'll end up doing lots of it. If you're not into it, you'll just find yourself bored, and you'll find something else you're interested in, hopefully. So the idea is that that's Shambhavi's project, the one on how social isolation affects behavior, then another on group dynamics. But really, our interest in social cognition came from our interest in how zebrafish perceive quantities. And like human beings, zebrafish care about the quantities of what? Other fish, right? They're very social beings. So it's like, zebrafish are a little bit like humans who, when they're not socially engaged, don't feel like eating, show depressive behavior. And so we actually came into social cognition as a subset of understanding how quantities are perceived by the zebrafish brain. And so most of our work is on quantity cognition, how trade-offs between quantities of different things are negotiated by zebrafish. And the other part of our lab works on crickets, which are the insects that call at night. And the connection between these two parts of the lab is that we look at communication in insects. And communication, when you're in school, what are you learning in primary school? Sort of a language and maths. And so these are the two things we work on in the lab, right? And they're connected because understanding language and hearing language is based on sort of, I'm speaking, I'm moving the air towards you in a pattern that you recognize, and you're interpreting meaning from what I'm saying in the pattern of how your eardrum has been activated. So pattern recognition and quantitative cognition underlies both communication and other forms of like quantitative cognition, like numerical cognition or understanding numbers or manipulations of numbers and things like that. Okay, so that's the kind of research that we do in the lab. And I teach 3 courses at Ashoka, all of which Shambhavi has taken probably, and Surabhi's taken one of them as well. So those are, roughly speaking, I teach for first years an introductory course, of what's called a foundation course called Mind and Behavior. And this is not a course in which I teach content so much as how to think about mind and behavior. And I see a lot of questions that relate to some stuff that we might discuss in mind and behavior. I'll get to those in a minute. Secondly, we have a course, I teach a course called Introduction to Neuroscience. Now, I'm largely teaching Introduction to Neuroscience for psychology students. They're the bulk of the students in the class, but I also get a lot of students from other disciplines like, mostly computer science and economics, right? And biology, of course, right? So biology, because both computer science and economics are huge departments, sometimes get more CS and econ students in the neuroscience class. And so the idea is that I teach neuroscience to people not as like some fancy subject, but really all of you have been using your brains for the last, over a decade of schooling. That makes you sound somewhat, old. Yeah, you've all been around for over a decade and at least. And so if you're using your brain to do all of this work, you should at least have some understanding of how your brain works. So regardless of what field you're in, I try to explain how your brain produces your thoughts. Yeah, I'm hoping all of you can still hear me. If you can, then I'd ask the organizers to maybe just put a thumbs up on the chat. Excellent, excellent, good. Okay. And then I also teach advanced neuroscience. I teach something called evolutionary cognition. That is, how does cognition evolve, and so on. So what I'm going to do is answer a couple of the questions that kind of relate here. So first of all, thank you, Yashwant. That's a sweet comment that you ended with. By the way, some of you are messaging and saying, ma'am, I'm a trans man. So that means my pronouns are he, or, you don't have to call me sir, but you can call me Bittu. Okay, no ma'am, if possible. Okay, so what books would I recommend for a psychology student, especially for the 12th grade? Well, one of the books that psychology students tend to love is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Right? And that's one book worth reading. Phantoms of the Brain is another book that a lot of students like to read. These are popular books, right? I would never recommend reading a textbook in psychology. In fact, as Shambhavi knows, I've also taught the Introduction to Psychology course for many people. Much of what I'm telling people is to question your psychology textbooks, right? Because psychology has a long history of being taught as a humanities subject, which basically means that there are various trends in psychology that don't follow the scientific method. Our coursework in Ashoka is specific to teaching psychology as a science. And so we ask you to take all of the interesting ideas that come from the humanities and think of how they do or do not describe group behavior among humans, right? Essentially, if you, once you are trying to think of what will clinically help somebody who comes to a clinic saying, I'm having this problem with my own behavior, like help me. And when someone asks you to help them, in a clinic, there's a burden of responsibility in terms of making sure that the that the advice that a clinician is giving is sound advice, that it works for groups of people, not just the particular individual that you're working with. And essentially, you don't have a sense of what works for what groups of people unless you start to get a sense of how mental health characterization works. And that mental health characterization has been done very unscientifically for many years, right? So there's a lot to question in your textbooks. One person said how to deal with insecure people at the workplace. All right. So, I don't think there is a singular scientific answer to this, but I would broadly say what makes people insecure. Psychologists have historically thought of insecurity as relating to what are called attachment wounds, which is sort of, what made you insecure in the first place, right? And often it's insecurity with respect to the people whom you are most attached to, parents, or other people whom you grew up around. When you're dealing with somebody who is behaving in an insecure way, whether it's at the workplace or home or anywhere else, two things seem to be important. One is to understand that the behavior that they're showing may not represent what they're feeling. What they're feeling may be something that requires you to imagine being present when they first experienced the insecurity as a child, right? So that allows you to operate from a place of empathy. But I think what is also important is to not let your empathy be a place where your own boundaries are being transgressed. So it's important to, from a place of empathy, set your boundaries about what kinds of behavior you will and will not tolerate. The other thing that I find useful, especially as a transgender professor, is to tell people how I expect them to behave. So when you set expectations in the first place and say, well, I expect you to treat me as a decent human being, right? I expect no discriminatory behavior from you. Expectation setting goes a long way in helping people who are insecure about a whole host of things, who maybe say meeting a trans person for the first time, etc., to figure out, it helps them navigate. And I tell them, this is what I expect from you. And then I set my boundaries when they don't, respond in that way. So that's a long answer to a short question. Please. In fact, Shambhavi will have attended more classes on this than I. So yes.
To add on to that, just the line of question was interesting because when you're saying insecure people, you're assuming that they're insecure. When a very baseline could be that there are two ways. So a person could seem insecure because of situational factors. So if the workplace, as maybe through their identity or a certain situation, has made them feel insecure, then that will come out. Or it might be a more personality characteristic where they are insecure at a level. So based on to that, there are different answers because if they're characteristically insecure, then there is nothing you can do to deal with them because then it's an individual thing that they have to kind of address and probably get into therapy for or look for professionals to talk to. But if you can judge and discover if it's a characteristics or situational thing, I think that will help you kind of navigate because if it's a situational thing, then you can address it because you might be involved in that workplace in certain context. You will have context of what is happening in there, so then you can like bring it up, see where it goes. There is no one answer to it in itself, but the wording of question was interesting because it's coming from a place of assumption that somebody is like you're attaching the characteristic to them without really thinking of where might it be coming from. Is it something that's coming from within them or is it something that's the environment is making them feel. So I think first thing is to then reflect on yourself. How are you looking at somebody?
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. I see a lot of questions piling up. There's one question about, well, lots of people are asking for my email address. I am not entirely sure where to type it so that you can see it, but it's very simple. It's Bittu, @ashoka.edu.in. You can also just Google Bittu Ashoka and you'll find me. Okay. So if you if you have the flyer, you'll have my name on it for this webinar, and you can just Google me. You'll find my email address on the website. Yeah. There's a question saying, does cognitive behavior work on connecting patterns like in CBT? I don't fully understand the question, but yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, works on the idea that that you can address what's considered the cognitive root of various behaviors, and the idea that behavioral change can be accomplished in ways that we understand the brain to work, which is with a series of you create sort of a series of steps to achieve the behavior that you want, and you create incentives at each stage of those behaviors. All right. Someone else asked, are you eligible to join in the 12th class? What's the procedure for joining? What kind of research takes place in the labs? Yes, as I said, you can just write me an email. I've told you how to contact me, and I've told you a little bit about what kind of research takes place in the labs. One more question about how. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Professor's lab is on the website, so you can just search Bittu's neuroethology lab, and you'll see. We haven't updated it yet, but you'll see the projects that are up there. You will see email IDs, so then you can reach out to those people also. You can also then reach out to Professor Bittu for the same.
Shambhavi, you're on the website, right? Because yes, because you've been in the lab long enough, so you should be good. You should be there. Okay, one person says Yashwant again says how to study consistently. Can I suggest tips? Honestly, I'm not a votary of studying consistently things that one's not interested in. I know that's not the advice that you're typically told to follow, but it's really key to how we teach the liberal arts, that you will pick the subject that you really enjoy and go for it. And within every subject, there are things to enjoy. It's hard to find out those things if you're just, emphasizing studying as kind of, this is something you should do versus this is something you could explore and enjoy, right? So it's a difference in teaching philosophy. But yeah, someone said Introduction to Psychology by King and Morgan ? It's probably an example of a textbook that I would deconstruct and ask you to think critically about if you were to do Intro to Psych with me. Does it go in a philosophical depth or scientific depth? Is there a difference between the two? All scientific questions are philosophical, I would say. Not all philosophical questions are scientific, but they are often the basis of scientific stuff. Social Psychology by Barron and Byrne. Hope they're good texts. Lots of textbooks are good in some sense, right? In that they will give you a sense of how people have thought about a subject. But with psychology, you should not do what you sometimes do with other kinds of textbooks, which is to trust कि ये textbook में है, so I can trust this information or this way of viewing the world as being scientific, right? That's not the case with a lot of psychology textbooks. Although paradoxically, social psychology actually has more of a rigorous scientific grounding than many others. Okay. If we read the books you mentioned, will it add a weighted element in college applications? I hope not. Ideally, colleges should just assess what you're interested in and how much you're interested in them, rather than have you read this or have you read that. But of course, if you are choosing to pursue your interests, it shows somebody who's interviewing you that you have, you've run with your interests. You've taken your interest and developed it. And that is always promising, I think. Okay, someone says, if I want to start my research and want to understand human brain and human behavior, where should I start? Resources, and keeping in mind that I'm a beginner in it. Good question. Do you have a recommendation for human brain and human behavior, Shambhavi?
I mean, with all honesty, I was reading a bunch of questions and a lot of them about, oh, where do we start? Where do we start? I think the best way to start is to start thinking of questions yourself.
Yes.
And then once you have some questions, just go on Google and ask for resources there. And not, when I say resources, I mean, instead of going for a textbook, because that's very rigid, So personally for me, I was really interested in trauma as a subject. And then I got introduced to this scientist called Rachel Yehuda. And through her, I read this book called, which I think till now is one of my favorite books in neuroscience itself, The Body Keeps the Score. uh, you get to see like science not at just in the sense that you expect it to see, not like some, like lab report, oh, this was done and this was done and this was done, but you get to see a larger picture of it. So you also get to develop and form your questions better. So I think one of the best way to get into neuroscience is to then maybe just observe, make questions of your own. And then as you make your questions and as you try to read whatever books you can get your hand on, even if they're not the best books in the world. There are some people, like, I will not take names, but you'll read their book and realize, oh, there is not something maybe not very scientific about it. But the best way to get to a good resource is to do the trial error method. You yourself read, you develop the habit of critically looking at it, you realize whether this is a text you would want to stay with or not. So that would
Absolutely.
be mine.
This is what, in our courses, we actually tell people to ditch the textbooks and just read primary scientific literature, right? So if go on Scholar, go to Google, but don't just go to google.com, go to scholar.google.com if you're looking for answers to your questions, and look at the evidence. Don't go by what a textbook says. Go by what the most recent evidence actually suggests, because many things that we're finding in recent evidence-based work contradicts what's there in psychology textbooks. Again, what's important to focus study? Interest, just interest is what I would keep saying. All right. So some questions about how do I prepare for being able to enter Ashoka for BSc Psychology? Likewise, I still think a lot of it is just about developing your interests and we teach as if you have not prepared at all, which is fine. We don't want some of the ways in which people prepare for psychology degree are counterproductive, right? Because again, sometimes people come and read a full textbook and they're like, but what about what I learned in the textbook? And it's very emotionally difficult to realize that you've put all this effort into kind of viewing the world in a certain way, which a instructor is deconstructing or saying, maybe you have to think critically about it, etc. All right. Then we have a bunch of science or whatever questions that are about, what is known in the field. So I'm going to read them out, Shambhavi, and then I'll ask you to take a first whack at these questions, and then I can also jump in. One, how do you deal with narcissistic friends? My one-word answer is boundaries, but I think it's important for you to hear from students because a lot of, establishing boundaries as a young person is much more difficult than establishing boundaries as an older person. And then someone says, what is the role of gossip? Kamlesh says, what is the role of gossip in helping Homo sapiens evolve and outsmart Homo erectus? Why is human being called a cognitive miser? Is the role of heuristics in solving problems? And so on. Okay, so Shambhavi, take a first whack, and then I'll come back and answer Kamlesh's question
So
also.
the first question was really interesting. What's the role of the gossip? It's very simple: to share knowledge, to communicate. How else will you build if let's say this webinar wasn't happening? So much of
That's right.
information held away from you. So
Correct.
gossip is a form of information sharing. At least that's how I would look at it. So that's the role of the gossip, to communicate. Uh, there is a question on heuristics
Yes,
also.
yes.
I am unsure of how should I answer that because
All right,
that's more
I'll
of
answer that.
behavioral.
But I'm
Yes.
curious on your take on what to do with narcissistic friends.
Uh, what to do with narcissistic friends? So that's something I have done. I don't think so. That's the advice I would like to give. But also, a lot of time narcissism, related to the previous question, is coming from a place of insecurity. Also a place of like wanting to have attention. So I think the best way to deal is to see if you have the space to kind of tolerate that behavior. Does this person really matter to you, in the sense, do you want to put your energy in them? Do you want to put your energy in this relationship with this person or not? And if you feel like you do, then you don't kind of need to address the narcissism in itself, but you need to kind of then talk to the person and see what's up in their life. Like, where is this coming from? Like, why do you have to put, like, let's say, why are you so self-centered? Like, you can't obviously confront somebody like that, but maybe put forward, hey, we talk a lot about you, or hey, like, this entire friendship is about you, but what about me? Like, it can't be, a one-way thing. So I think for you to address it, first you need to address within yourself, does how much this person matters to you? Do you want to invest your energy and time into them? Because energy saving is a thing. And after you have established that, then you can see if it's at what point do they make you uncomfortable, because you will find like traces of narcissism in people and it doesn't really do anything to you. So maybe what is it doing to you? How is it affecting you? And then you can bring it up, and that could be a point, because I don't think so the point of friendship is for you to fix somebody, but it's
Very,
so
very
that
key.
you don't get hurt in that relationship. So just bring up in the ways that it's hurting you.
Yeah, um, I think a key question of how to relate to a narcissistic friend depends on, how the narcissistic or self-centeredness plays out with respect to you, right? A lot of us have friends with whom we have some distance, that is to say, we're part of their support system, but then it's also important for us to hold them accountable when they treat other people badly. If we're a direct target of any kind of abuse by anybody, again, you can have empathy for where that abuse comes from, but it's important to create boundaries such that their self-centeredness does not take a toll on you. And that's important for everybody to learn. Okay, I'll answer Kamlesh's question about the role of gossip in helping Homo sapiens evolve and outsmart Homo erectus, because it's a really good example of a mixed question, which is great fun to deconstruct, because I kept talking about deconstruction and critical thinking. So let me bring that to this question. First of all, my entire course on evolutionary cognition is about this question of what makes brains evolve. And one of the main things I teach is that the entire field of evolutionary psychology is, it involves a lot of theorization with very little evidence. And then we get into the question of what evidence would you need to see before feeling or thinking or being convinced that some behavior has evolved for XYZ reason. And we point out that answering the why question in evolution is actually very, very difficult. And we talk about a few examples of the kinds of evidence you have to put in place before you can make the claim to answer a why question. And so, did Homo sapiens evolve because of gossip or because of several other things? I mean, we're all evolving all the time. The root cause of our evolution is mutation. But is selection playing a role, right? Does something offer an evolutionary advantage? These are things which in fact, the project that Shambhavi and I are working on is very similar. We're looking at the evolution of depressive traits and whether it can be an advantage in some circumstance, right? And we struggle to figure out, what do we have to show? What do we have to do to show that something is, advantages in some situation? So I would say, gossip may well have played a role in evolution. It may have not, but we may not ever have the evidence to answer that question. Two, you said Homo sapiens outsmarting Homo erectus, right? I would ask, are we sure that Homo sapiens outsmarted Homo erectus? Of course, Homo erectus is extinct. Homo sapiens seems quite determined to make itself extinct relatively soon. So is smartness, however you define that, necessarily related to who happens to be here now? Is it also about a series of accidents, right? In terms of which animals have survived and which animals have not. Then you have an interesting question about how, why is a human being called a cognitive miser, and what's the role of heuristics in solving problems? So humans are not unusual in being cognitive misers. The idea of cognitive miserliness is the idea that, jada dimag mat lagao. That is the idea, right? Ki all of us find it hard. There are many problems in the world that are very hard to solve, basically, right? So many of us think कि इस problem पे ज़्यादा दिमाग नहीं लगाते हैं. जो लोग कहते हैं, we'll just try that. You just ask someone else for advice, or you start to follow rules of thumb, right? And heuristics are like that, right? They are things that make decision making easier. You're not necessarily going through a formal process of collecting evidence around every decision you make. Sometimes you're using rules of thumb to assess a situation. So that's heuristics, and humans are not the only cognitive misers. Many animals look, the way their brains learn is to learn associatively. And if they associatively learn that a heuristic helps them, or if they learn that a heuristic helps them through trial and error, or they think it helps through trial and error, then they will sometimes rely on heuristics instead of more complex cognitive strategies. Okay. Couple questions more about installing interest interest is not like an app. You can't install it. It does develop. And if you're not interested in something and you want to be interested in something, you can try to explore it. But again, an approach of I should be interested or you should be interested doesn't tend to work, right? So you can always just play around and explore with explore new things that you but ideally not because you want to end up interested in them. There's so many things of interest. You have to decide what kind of life you want, right? How do you want to spend your life? How do you want to spend your time? Okay, another question. Does psychology have a very quantitative and analytical view, or is it more people-focused? And does it change with the situation? Okay, again, here's what I would ask you if I were to critically unpack your question. Yes, psychology as a science has a quantitative and analytical view. There's also a strong place for qualitative work in psychology literature, right? But these two are not necessarily antithetical to each other. So there's a lot of work which mixes methods in the qualitative and quantitative. In fact, Shambhavi, you've done some qualitative research as well, right? So you can maybe talk about this. And the other question that you've asked in this is it more people focused? So it makes it sound as if it's people focused, it's not quantitative and analytical, right? All psychology, human psychology, is people focused. The quantitative work is people focused and the qualitative work is also people focused. And does it change with the situation? Yes, everything changes with situations. All right, go ahead. Shambhavi, maybe you have some ideas for that and also for the next question, maybe on depression.
Yeah, this question reminded me of the first question Professor Annie asked in QRM. Is psychology a science or a humanities subject?
Yeah.
And there is no one answer to it, because the assumption, if you say that it's not science, is to then say that, oh, it's isolated and decontextualized, which is what the issue with science would be, because you can't study anything in isolation. So if you're looking at, let's say, anything, if you're looking at a disorder, if you're looking at anemia, how is it not, it have to be affected by the resources that place have, the environment that place has, the physical landscape and everything. So there's no one word answer to it. Psychology is quantitative and analytical, and it is analytical and quantitative while also looking at people. Although one thing that is not here is the assumption that if it's not quantitative or analytical, it would become people focused, which is not the way it works. Psychology is about more or less behavior, whether that's human behavior or animal behavior or just behaviors in general. It is qualitative as well as quantitative, would be my answer. And the next question by Kamlesh is also very interesting. Depression, schizophrenia, etc. are caused by lower high levels of neurotransmitters. The social and cultural factors also play an important role in causing disorders. So, I mean, one way to look at it, yes, there are neurotransmitters involved, like there is a neural system involved in certain disorders acting out, but it's a very common debate of nature versus nurture, where the social aspect would come in. So, let's say you have, I wouldn't say the genes, but I can't find that one word. Maybe you're likely to get some disorder, but if your environment doesn't give you, like, push you for that, it would not probably express itself. So a simple word answer, yes, social and cultural factors do play an important role in causing the disorders, but like disorders which do involve neural basis also have an effect. Although which one has more power than the other stays unanswered.
Yeah, that varies a lot from one trait to another, and different traits have different degrees of genetic influence and social influence. And there are various ways that we discuss in my classes of judging what the roles of these different things are in specific contexts. But to connect back to the topic of this webinar, which is stress or social situations and stress. Stress is a major social and cultural factor that increases the probability of depression and increases the probability of schizophrenia, given whatever neural background you have. So if you and a relative have the same version of the gene that predisposes you towards either depression or schizophrenia, a stressful life is going to make one of you more likely to develop full-blown depression or schizophrenia than a low-stress life. So बच्चों tension मत लो. Like it's really life-saving to not take too much tension beyond a point. I know that you are often very tense in school and before college, but yes, protect your brains from stress-related damage. Netra's question is very good. How do you differentiate between internal and external factors when judging one's behavior, right? And the question really is, what is internal and what is external? Because one of the things we also teach is that your internal, so suppose genes, right? Your DNA is inside your body, so it's definitionally internal. But your brain is also inside your body. And your brain is influenced both by genes and by social interaction, right? So, things that are inside you are also a result of things that are deeper inside you. That is to say, that seem to, genes themselves don't seem to be changed by society. But how much of each gene you express is affected by society, and then your brains are certainly affected. So therefore, many external things can be internally represented. And it's hard to differentiate between these, but certainly the genetic contribution to behavior can be judged based on various tricks that we use. The simplest one is to look at the relationship between the degree of relatedness between people. So, for example, identical twins versus fraternal twins, and the degree to which the trait, if one person has it, is shared by another person. So broadly speaking, the genetic component is thought to be higher if, the situation which Bollywood keeps bringing before us, which is of great interest to psychologists, which is Judwa twins separated at birth, right? When that happens, if there are similarities in behavior with twins who share all their genetic material across social contexts, then that's considered one indicator of how much of a role genes play. And there are other things that you can use as well. Again, Vishwesh asked, does it deal with things in a philosophical sense or scientific sense? Always both. Scientific, certainly, but which is also philosophical. Okay. Kamlesh says, can you explain rational emotive therapy with an example? I have no idea what rational emotive therapy is. Do you, Shambhavi? Okay. In fact, one of the things that I critically examine is what does the word rational even mean? So that's one of the things that we critically examine in the lab, right? There's no working definition of rationality. And many of the therapies that use the word rational tend to be, things that are trying to sort of sound scientific, right? But yeah, I mean, I can Google this, but I assume you're looking for an expert opinion. So that's not something I can provide. Okay, quick question. Great. I'm so glad that one of your kids is our student. And I'm really glad that that she has a love for learning. And exploring beyond academics, as a parent, how do you motivate them? Again, if there's a love for learning, they will motivate themselves. The question really becomes what, maybe you can help with searching for options that you think are in line with their interests beyond academics as well. Okay. Please update. Are the psychology laboratories world-class? And what are the applications of liberal arts if internships, research, and publishing psycho research? Okay. Well, I'm not a big fan of the term world-class. I'm not a big fan of class in general. As I said, I would like to have a world in which psychology experiments can be done very cheaply by students in the poorest of schools world over. But yes, everything that you would need to do psychology research world class, that is to say, of the same degree of complicated research as in many other parts of the world, are found in Ashoka. There are things that are not found in Ashoka, but that are found in institutions that we have connections with. For example, the most expensive thing that you can use probably in psychology research, I mean, there are more, but the most commonly used and most expensive is something called fMRI. So we don't have an fMRI machine, which is a large magnet, very expensive machine here, but we have a connection with a place called National Brain Research Center, which does have that. Otherwise, other facilities like, electrophysiology, single cell to EEGs, FNERs, what else do we have? Eye tracking, virtual reality, all of these things exist in Ashoka. And yes, as I said, you can do internships and publish your research. Okay. Again, Purva says, how to study when you don't want to. Typically, what I do is not push myself to study, but try to, or didn't, and even now, is to kind of to just see whether there is something rescuably interesting about what you're looking at. And there always is something interesting. But an interesting question from Amrita: how to overcome the guilt of past mistakes? I've done a few, and they too are small. But I try to overcome that guilt, but after sometimes I get seized by the fear. I always want to see myself as flawless. Maybe because of that, I can't accept those. So what should I do? So again, I will defer to Shambhavi first, and then I'll see if I can add anything.
I mean, overcome guilt of past. So what to me at least it sounds like a certain sense of dissonance because you your actions or at least what you're trying to put forward is that you're flawless, but then you're aware of things that makes you not very flawless. So when those two ideas of your identity come into contrast, it creates a sense of fear. So I think the best way to overcome is to accept that it's okay to make mistakes. Also, while you can hold yourself accountable, that doesn't mean that you hold it over your head. So you can be like, hey, I did this thing which wasn't very nice, but it's okay. I learn from it. I don't do it again. So I think the best way to overcome is to not let these two ideas about yourself contrast. Let both of yourself, like contradictions, exist in peace.
Yeah. I think wanting to see oneself as flawless, which is, I think, a very strong social pressure, is a cognitive construct one should just not buy into. You should completely debunk the idea that you or anybody can be flawless or should be even flawless, partly because what is sometimes considered flawed may be, socially, acceptable, but maybe ethically flawed, right? So what is considered flawed in one context may be not flawed in another context, or vice versa, right? So what is a flaw is a very relative question as well. So
We were going to have a bunch of polls up on the webinar
right,
so that more of us can interact and just
that's
show
right.
our interest and
You get a sense of
where
what.
the conversation is going. So if
Yeah.
all of you can go ahead and do it.
I'll answer one niche question, which is about the author Steven Pinker. Do I have any thoughts on their literature? Well, Steven Pinker is a good example of someone whom we teach critically about. Um, I teach some of Stephen's writing on language, including the idea that all language produced by humans is genetically complete, regardless of what language it is, and which deconstructs a lot of the kind of hierarchy, and this is the pure form of the language and all of that. Of course, these are ideas that originate from Chomsky. They're just popularized by Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker is also somebody who I put up in my class as somebody who has been on in an important debate on sexism, where he was defending, a viewpoint, which some, myself included, might consider sexist. So we also critically watch a debate involving Steven Pinker. So I have therefore mixed thoughts on on his work. All right. Yeah, maybe I will go ahead to a few more questions down. There's a girl in my school who has Down syndrome. I'm a psychology student in grade 12. There are symptoms which you see in a normal Down syndrome child, but her intelligence is not what you might expect in a child with Down syndrome. Is she different from others? Is that normal? Is it something unique? Well, all of us are simultaneously normal and simultaneously unique, right? So I just would caution against assessing intelligence in a singular way, whether it's done with this child or with anybody. And I would say that with all education, including education, in a neurodiverse world, that you really need to get a sense of what cognitive skill someone is, any child shows an interest in, and help, rather than sort of pressuring children to kind of, show a set number of cognitive skills that are predefined, right, by a group of adults. So that's my answer. Okay. Another question: what are your views on Sigmund Freud? Are his findings taught in Ashoka? Similar to Pinker, I teach examples of findings of Freud that have been scientifically validated, and I debunk many findings of Freud that are scientifically debunked and invalidated. So we very much teach the findings, but we teach them critically, unlike many textbooks, which just reproduce his views as if they are scientifically valid, as if they are
Also,
only scientifically valid. Yeah.
you get to read Freud not as just like the father of psychology, but as some, and like understand the more historical and political sense of how science actually goes and how things develop. So in that sense, also you get to visit Freud, but I don't think so we worship him or
That's
anything.
correct. That's correct. In fact, we start with, one of my classes starts with Freud as an example of someone whom one shouldn't worship, right? In general, we caution against worship as a strong anti-scientific kind of trend, especially when someone is called the father of this science or that science, right? You have to question the social processes that set up that construction, and so on. Okay. How to go about writing a research paper on particular traits in people depending on their age and gender based off of handwriting. One of the things we teach in my mind and behavior class is why and how graphology is pseudoscience. So you can write a research paper of this kind, but I would encourage you to think about what makes something in psychology pseudoscience versus science. So look at the scientific literature on whether handwriting is in fact predictive. Okay, Divya asked a question about how to prepare my daughter for a faculty interaction for psychology. I would say pretend you're the interviewer and ask your daughter, what are you interested in psychology? Like, what is it that you want to do? Right? Ask about the interests. Even if they never end up, using that in interview, it will be a useful discussion for your daughter and for yourself. And that's the best way to prepare, I think. All right. Can I illustrate the science of neuroscience in disorders like depression, schizophrenia, and OCD? Again, I'm not a fan of calling things disorders because it assumes that something is ordered and something else is disordered. These are various ways in which brains exist. And yes, we have a good sense of the neural correlates of sort of what neural connectivity, varieties or variance in neural connectivity underlies variance in behaviors that relate to depression, schizophrenia, and OCD. I mean, if you like, I can give you a list of the brain areas that we think that are specifically involved in these. But yeah, I'm not sure everybody wants to want such a detailed explanation. So I'll go ahead so far. Someone asked if I'm the Einstein of neuroscience. That's very sweet. I'm really not. As I said, I'm opposed to any idea that any one person is an Einstein or or particularly unusual. But I'm really glad that you're enthusiastic about joining the lab and working. And I want all of you, all of the students, and really actually all of the parents as well, to feel empowered with respect to the field of psychology. What do I think about pirating scientific literature from websites like Anna's Archives? Do I think research should be limited behind a paywall? No, not at all. In fact, as all my students know, I strongly encourage pirating. I am part of the scientific community which signed the petition against the banning of Sci-Hub and I strongly believe that scientific research should not be limited behind a paywall, and that the scientific community should organize around this. Many of us are organizing around it because scientific literature, the people who you pay for scientific literature are not the people who do scientific research. We do scientific research. We're paid salaries, and we are supposed to produce research for the public. So that research should be freely available. We should do away with the scientific industry, which was created like a Ponzi scheme. And it's an institution that we will have to dismantle, I think, for science to actually be available for people worldwide. How do I prepare my daughter for faculty interaction? Oh, that I've already answered. Okay. I can sometimes sense myself being a narcissist. I can't help it. It comes naturally. I realize it later and feel guilty, but then I don't care again. What does this say about me? Do I need help? Okay, very interesting question. Lots of behaviors will come naturally, both behaviors that are helpful to others and behaviors that aren't. And I think all of us, and especially, I'm a parent of a young child, when you're raising a toddler, you realize that behaving selfishly is often something that comes very naturally to very young kids, right? And so the question of this balance between acting in a self-interest versus in the interests of others is really a key question of social psychology, right? And as I said, the question of whether you need help is not a question someone else can answer. If you want help, if you feel like you've been raised in a way, so for example, I certainly felt this, right? that, growing up, often we are all culturally raised by a society to sort of think about ourselves over others, right? I mean, we're all told, watch out for yourself, you make sure that you have a good job, make sure, and we're very rarely raised to think about social problems and to act collectively and so on. So whether you need help depends on where you want to be and what you want your life to be like. And not everything is changeable, but self-awareness makes a huge difference in how one interacts with somebody else. And often, if one's experiencing something which makes one think, am I a narcissist? It may be that even if you don't need help to go from day to day, that analyzing this or trying to understand yourself in therapy will always be useful for you. So I would say selfishly, for anyone who's self-identifying as a narcissist or as a psychopath or as a sociopath, right? There isn't necessarily anything wrong with you, or it's not necessarily something that you should feel guilty about, but it is useful to understand the roots of where it comes from in your life. That's something that's useful for everybody. If you are the opposite, if you find yourself to be hyper empathetic, unable to set boundaries, and constantly doing what other people expect you to do, likewise, I would say, I tend to think therapy is useful for everybody. The remaining question is sort of, how do we set up therapy so that it's collectively available to most people? But yes. All right. How do I prevent my friend from trying to take extreme measures with himself? I said broadly, I would say the answer to that is also therapy, destigmatizing therapy and getting them help. It's hard to single-handedly prevent a friend from taking extreme measures with themselves. So always involve more people, especially if you're a young person. Please make sure you involve some adults. You may want to talk to your friend about which adults they trust and are willing to involve. But yes, always make sure, taking care of friends is something that, as I said, setting a boundary means you want to help somebody, you should be part of helping, but you should never be the only person helping, because that will overextend your boundaries. It will take over your life. So make sure that the answer to many of these is to organize collectively, right? Make sure there's a group doing something around this. Okay. I'm glad you have the will to publish your book. Yes, I'm glad. Do emotions shape your thoughts or vice versa? Are there thoughts which are not emotional? Are there emotions which aren't related to thought? That's the question I have for you in return. Interesting question by Sukanta. How to remove mathematics anxiety of secondary school students? Very good question. It's hard to remove anxiety once it's there. That's one of the scary things about schooling, right? Is that your kids may go into schools where they experience anxiety around things like math. And other examples. I can answer a little bit from my experience with teaching neuroscience to people who have neuroscience anxiety. And that is basically, I break it down. I try to take away the power of the words, the big fancy words, and I try to teach it from first principles, right? And I teach neuroscience from kitchen ingredients. And destigmatizing, taking all of the fanciness out of it makes a big difference, right? So I would say if a child has mathematics anxiety, play with it, right? Make it a game, right? A lot of the anxiety comes from pressure. So tell them, I don't care how you perform in a test, but I want you to start having fun with maths again. And everything that you think about maths that causes anxiety, these aren't important to me, right? That is important, I think, to make sure that kids don't feel that kind of pressure. As a psychologist, do you believe in God, or at least the traditional understanding of God? My answer is, as a scientist, I cannot possibly believe in any understanding of God. Okay, believed obesity is inherent in genes. It's influenced by genes, but again, as with many traits, socialization, diet, exercise, all of these and stress. Stress is a major sort of cause of obesity and so on, and triggering diabetes and so on. So all of these things make a difference. Okay, we're very close to time, so I'll see how many more questions I can answer. The questions keep going up as I keep answering them and thinking we're making progress, but lots of new questions. One really nice question on the fundamental attribution error. Yes, it influences all judgments. What strategies can mitigate it? Understanding what fundamental attribution error goes a long way, but it does not correct for it. So many of our biases It helps to understand them. It helps mitigate it, but it doesn't understanding a bias doesn't eliminate bias. So it's important to realize that. What's my opinion of self-evaluation of cognitive behavior? Useful, but not sufficient. Useful to get other people's opinions as well, especially therapists, trained therapists. How do you deal with elders who want your good but suppress your voice? Tricky. I think talking to them about how suppressing your voice, your voice is not helpful for you may work, but each of you knows best how to deal with the elders in your particular, circle. What can you integrate to psychology to make into a career? Maybe I'll leave this question, and how to integrate psychology with my interest in business. These are a couple of questions that I might leave to you, Shambhavi, or I'll just quickly say there are many things that you can do with psychology as a career, right? So you can, of course, be involved in clinical work. You can be a therapist or a psychiatrist. Of course, you can do research and so on. You can teach. But there's lots of other stuff like sports psychology or forensic psychology that people tend to be very interested in. And there's a lot of just understanding, one question is on your interest in business. Business decisions are often decisions that are predicated on what people think humans are going to buy. And those are questions in neuroeconomics that you can work on. All right. I'm guessing that we may have to close the seminar soon. Organizers, I'll leave it up to you as to what we do at this stage. I can try and answer individual questions for a little bit longer by typing them. Questions about what makes us change our behavior, often incentives. What intensity does music frequency have on our brain? Under research, lots of effects still under research. I mean, lots of new things that we keep finding out. Is there a cause of Alzheimer's disease? Yes, protein misfolding. Can it be cured? Seems like it can't, but it can be mitigated as of now. Might be cured if we are able to avoid, do some genetic engineering of the protein that causes it, but that we don't have, that's not something one can implement in humans now. How do hidden biases form in our brains? Just through associative learning from the biased worlds we see around us. What ways can we use to lessen them? As I said, to reduce, awareness reduces it, but it doesn't eliminate bias. All right, someone asked, I'm a queer person, interested in psych. I'm not sure if I'm interested. Did I ever have this crisis while choosing what to study? Not quite. I feel like queerness very much informed my interest in biology and psychology. But yeah, you can always email me if you have questions about this. And never feel crisis when choosing what to study. Just go with your heart, right? Which is a way of saying go with your brain, right? Go with your instincts about what you enjoy doing. Not what you think is fancy, but what you actually enjoy doing. What are triggers that can activate something like paranoia? Stress, other things as well. All right, lots of other questions, which I think somebody asked, does Ashoka expose students into various fields like sports and child psychology? Not heavily so. These are niche fields, but we have enough alumni who've gone on to work in these areas that we can connect you with them. Okay, too many more questions, I think, for us to answer, but how to overcome, lots of questions about how to overcome OCD, et cetera, that I think, ADHD, et cetera. Why is socialization essential? It's not, but all of these, I think, are things that are useful to actually bring to therapists. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about more of Chomsky's work and whatnot, and what does math do to our brain? Excellent question. Very few answers. That's why we work on it, etc. And neural pain, critical headaches, all of these are, we understand, a product of both neural activity as well as the way in which our immune systems sometimes handle inputs. Okay, some questions I think are repeats questions. So, but tips for high school students considering a foray into research, just dive in. Someone asked, what does a minor in biology cover? There's a specific set of courses. You can find this on the website. Why do we find things beautiful? Good question.
A lot of interesting questions.
About, jealousy, imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Very, very, very interesting questions. I hope we can save this chat. I'd love to respond to more of these. Um,
I think
and
we'll be able to have them with you,
yeah,
Professor, right?
wonderful, wonderful. And
Yeah.
as I said, the simple thing for anyone who has further questions is you can feel free to email me. I'll answer one last question about, is there a master's in psychology? Not in Ashoka, but we do have there are many master's programs in psychology that our bachelor students go on to. We offer a bachelor's degree and we offer a PhD. So
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. That was such an insightful session. And I think the questions kept coming. We have so many interesting questions. But thank you so much, Professor and Shambhavi, for doing this, taking out your time. Thank you to the audience for joining in. I really hope you got a glimpse into how humans, behave in social contexts. Before we wrap up the session, we would really, really appreciate if you could take a minute to just share your valuable feedback with us. The link to the feedback form is provided in the chat box. This session, the recording will be provided on Ashoka's YouTube channel in case you want to revisit it, share it with your friends. Next webinar of Explore is scheduled for 29 September, next Monday at 6 p.m. The session will be delivered by Professor Krishna, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Biology. The title of his talk is Unlocking the Mysteries of Sleep, and I think a lot of you would be interested in that. I would once again like to inform our audience that registrations for the undergraduate program are starting. So please, please, please register soon. If you have any further queries regarding any other aspects of the university, feel free to also write us at ugapply@ashoka.edu.in. We will be putting the email in the chat box as well. Once again, I thank you, Professor and Shambhavi, from the bottom of my heart for taking out the time to participate and sharing your valuable insights with all of us. So thank you, everybody, for joining.